So we're Francois and Sheila Haas. I think it's easy to tell who goes with which name. And our friendship with Thiago began in the early summer of 1977, which came at a fairly momentous personal time for us, which is why it's easy to recall the date. And I was kind of opened a door to Francois's story, which is really how it all began. So I will just briefly refer to the door that opened, and then Francois will recount his story, which is so emblematic in many ways of Thiago. I had discovered at a friend's house the recorder, and I thought it was a lot of fun. It was a way to get back into music. And when I got home from this visit, I went to a local music store. We live in the village. And I had noticed a music store near Sheridan Square called Pietro Derros. And I went in one day, and he had everything that I needed. I got my first recorder. I got my beginning instructional material. And I went back in every so often to get new music to play. And I asked Pietro for some advice one day, because Francois was really in love with the lute, and he had spoken every so often about his desire to learn to play it. So I asked Pietro if he by some chance knew of a lute teacher in the city who he could recommend. And I mentioned why, and he said, well, does your husband play the guitar? I said, no, he's never played an instrument before, but he's in love with the lute. So he said, well, I seriously suggest that he start with a guitar. The lute is extraordinarily complex, and let him master a simpler instrument, which is a prelude to the lute. So I went home and gave Francois the news, and he thought about it, and he decided to set his sights on the guitar first. And on a Saturday early that summer, we went to Pietro Derros, and he took his first steps, and now Francois takes over.
Yeah. To me, the first steps was, why don't I get a book on how to play the guitar? And which is what I did. And I went home and I started looking through it. It wasn't exactly like the instructions on running a computer. And at one point I turned to Sheila. I said, if I'm going to play the guitar, I probably should get a guitar. So we went back, and I asked Pietro, so you have, again, we spoke about the lute, and he said, well, you should learn to play the guitar. I said, well, if I could play the guitar the way this guy is in the back of the room where all the guitars were, I'd consider it. So I said, but how do you choose a guitar? He said, well, I don't know. So I went, and there was this gentleman playing very, very mellow music, and there was such a feeling about the way he was playing. So I said, excuse me, could I ask you a question? And he said, sure, what? With an accent. And he said, sure, what? I said, how do you choose a guitar? And he looked at me and he said, well, you choose it the way you choose a woman. You wrap your arms around it. You caress it. And the one that feels right is the right one. And I was sold. And then I said, by the way, do you teach guitar, or do you know a good teacher? He said, well, I happen to teach at the UN. So I said, you want to take on another student? It was good for me because I worked on 34th Street, so it was really, really easy. And so we got to know each other, and then turns out we shared a passion, soccer. He says, oh yeah, I know, I've played, I've coached, I know a few players like Pele. And so I was obviously very impressed. And we started talking about it, and then we became friends. And then the last thing was we had a son who I pushed towards soccer. He hated baseball, and he wasn't big enough to play basketball. And Thiago came to him. He says, if your son is going to be a good player, if you're going to be a good player, ding dong, as he called him, you have to learn to play with both feet. And so he would take Alex out and teach him how to play with his left foot. And during that time, our friendship grew, and he was part of our family.